Hey guys, tonight, we are going to travel back in time. Imagine waking before dawn, the first light just brushing the lake's edge, your bare feet pressing into damp soil. Every day begins the same way, with the weight of expectation pressing down as heavily as the sun soon will. You move carefully along narrow chinampa paths, balancing baskets of soil and seeds, tending crops that must thrive to feed families, neighbors, and the city beyond. This was the rhythm of life for the farmers of the Aztec Empire, a world of meticulous labor, patient observation, and constant vigilance. Corn, beans, and squash were not simply planted. They were coaxed from the soil with care, their success the difference between surplus and scarcity. Water had to be managed, weeds removed, canals maintained, and pests controlled, all by hand, in a landscape both fertile and fragile. Despite the grandeur of Tenochtitlan rising above the lake, the daily reality of sustenance was far from grand. The work was relentless, physical, and unceasing, shaped by centuries of inherited knowledge and environmental pressures. Every seed sown, every terrace maintained, was an act of endurance and precision, a quiet struggle against the unpredictability of nature. In this video, we will step into the fields, the canals, and the terraces of the Aztec world, uncovering the grueling, exacting labor that sustained an empire. From the careful construction of chinampas to the seasonal rituals of planting and harvest, we'll explore the tedious, tireless, and often unseen work behind the seemingly abundant tables of Tenochtitlan. This is the story of Aztec agriculture, not of warriors or conquests, but of the patient hands, the steady rhythms, and the quiet persistence that made life possible. Dawn over the basin. Before the first light touched the rim of the surrounding mountains, the basin of Mexico lay quiet beneath a pale sky. The lakes reflected a faint shimmer, broken only by the slow movement of waterfowl drifting between reeds. In the distance, the city of Tenochtitlan rested upon its island foundations, its temples and dwellings still subdued in shadow. Yet long before priests climbed the temple stairs or traders arranged their goods in the marketplace, another rhythm had already begun, the patient labor of agriculture. The Aztec world depended upon cultivation. Fields, gardens, and floating plots sustained the population of the valley, anchoring ceremonial grandeur to the soil beneath it. Despite the grandeur of temples and the complexity of tribute systems, food production remained the most constant and unglamorous undertaking. Each season required foresight. Each day demanded repetition. The Basin of Mexico was not an easy landscape. Surrounded by highland ridges and fed by seasonal rains, it contained a chain of lakes whose salinity varied from place to place. Some waters were brackish and unsuitable for irrigation. Others provided fresh water that could nurture crops. Communities along the shores learned to read the subtle differences in soil and moisture, selecting appropriate areas for planting. Geography dictated routine. The most distinctive feature of Aztec agriculture lay upon the shallow edges of the lakes, the chinampas. These rectangular plots, often described as floating gardens, were in fact carefully constructed platforms anchored to the lake bed. Farmers wove reeds into frames, layered them with mud and aquatic vegetation, and reinforced the edges with willow trees whose roots secured the structure. Over time, these plots became stable and fertile, drawing nutrients from the surrounding water. Tending a chinampa required early rising. Canoes slipped silently along narrow canals as cultivators inspected their crops. The air carried the scent of damp earth and plant growth. Dew collected on maize leaves, catching the first rays of dawn. Rows had to be examined for pests, soil had to be loosened with simple wooden tools, and irrigation channels required clearing to maintain steady flow. Maize stood at the center of this agricultural life. It was more than sustenance. It formed the backbone of ritual, tribute, and daily nourishment. Seeds were placed carefully into prepared mounds, often accompanied by small offerings acknowledging the spiritual dimension of cultivation. The planting cycle aligned with seasonal observances, reflecting a worldview in which human effort and cosmic order intertwined. Beans and squash grew alongside maize, their intertwined growth supporting and nourishing one another. This method of companion planting maximized limited space while enriching soil fertility. Yet the process was neither effortless nor swift. Weeding occupied many hours, and vigilance remained constant against insects and fungal blight. Even slight negligence could reduce yields upon which entire households depended. On the mainland beyond the lakes, terraced hillsides marked additional zones of cultivation. Stones formed retaining walls that prevented erosion during seasonal rains. These terraces required regular maintenance. Loose rocks had to be reset, drainage channels repaired, and sediment redistributed. Such tasks seldom drew attention in grand narratives, yet they consumed immense amounts of time. Agricultural labor followed a predictable cadence shaped by climate. The rainy season brought relief and anxiety simultaneously. Showers nourished seedlings, but could also overwhelm fields if drainage failed. During drier months, water management became a careful balancing act. Canals and dikes built across portions of the lakes controlled salinity and protected farmland from flooding. Maintenance of these structures demanded collective effort coordinated through local leadership. Tools remained simple. The digging stick, hardened by fire, served as the primary instrument for turning soil. There were no draft animals to pull plows. Human hands performed every action. Repetition defined progress. Each mound formed through individual motion. Each seed pressed into earth by deliberate placement. Women participated actively in agricultural preparation, especially in seed selection and post-harvest processing, knowledge of which kernels to preserve for future planting passed through generations. After harvest, maize underwent nixtamalization, a process of soaking and cooking with alkaline substances that enhanced nutritional value. Grinding stones wore smooth under continuous use, shaping flour for daily tortillas. The surrounding environment influenced decisions about planting schedules. Frost posed a particular danger in high-altitude regions. Farmers monitored cloud patterns and wind direction, drawing upon inherited understanding of seasonal change. Observations accumulated gradually, forming a body of practical knowledge rarely recorded, yet deeply embedded in community life. Chinampas offered remarkable productivity, capable of multiple harvests within a single year. However, sustaining such output required unceasing attention. Mud dredged from canals had to be spread upon the plots to replenish nutrients. Aquatic weeds removed from waterways served as compost. The boundary between lake and land remained fluid, demanding careful delineation. Agricultural organization intersected with social hierarchy. Land distribution operated through kalpuli, kin-based community units responsible for allocating plots among members. Each household cultivated its assigned section, but contributed to communal obligations. Tribute assessments from subject regions further supplemented the food supply of the capital, linking distant provinces to the basin's needs. The monotony of tending crops shaped daily experience. There was little variation from one morning to the next during peak growing season. Inspect, weed, irrigate, repair. Return again the following day. Repetition instilled familiarity with every inch of soil. Farmers could identify subtle differences in texture or moisture by touch alone. Birds represented both beauty and threat. Herons glided above canals, while smaller species pecked at seedlings. Simple deterrents, woven nets, or raised platforms helped guard vulnerable areas. Children often assisted in these tasks, learning from observation rather than formal instruction. Seasonal festivals honored agricultural deities, yet ritual moments punctuated rather than replaced routine. Offerings acknowledged dependence upon forces beyond human control, but labor continued regardless of ceremony. Crops required constant presence. As the sun rose fully above the mountains, activity increased. Canoes transported harvested vegetables toward markets. The city's population relied heavily upon produce grown within close proximity. Freshness mattered. Perishable goods needed swift distribution. Despite efficiency, agriculture remained physically demanding. Knees pressed into damp soil for extended periods. Shoulders bore loads of harvested maize. Hands hardened through contact with rough plant fibers. Fatigue accompanied the setting sun, only to be followed by preparation for the next day. The quiet dignity of this work rarely appeared in carved stone or painted codices. Yet without it, no temple could have been built, no tribute collected, no ceremony sustained. Beneath the splendor of empire lay an intricate web of cultivation, rooted in patience and repetition. As evening approached, the basin's surface reflected warm hues of fading light. Smoke drifted upward from cooking fires. Within homes constructed of adobe and reed, families gathered to share meals derived directly from fields tended hours earlier. The cycle closed gently, only to begin again before dawn. Agriculture in the Aztec world was not defined by dramatic innovation each season. It advanced through careful observation, gradual refinement, and disciplined routine. The lakes shimmered, the mountains stood unchanged, and within that enduring landscape, generations persisted in the steady labor that sustained an empire. The following morning would mirror the last, yet subtle shifts: growth of stalks, swelling of ears, deepening of roots, marked quiet progress invisible from a distance. Within that gradual transformation lay the true substance of Aztec agriculture: persistent effort shaped by environment, belief, and communal obligation. Seasons of obligation. Beyond the narrow canals and willow-lined plots, the agricultural year unfolded according to a ritual calendar that shaped movement across the basin. The turning of seasons did not arrive suddenly. It announced itself through subtle alterations in wind, in the angle of sunlight along the lake's surface, and in the distant clarity of mountain peaks. Farmers observed these shifts closely, aligning their labor with both practical necessity and ceremonial timing. The Mexica people, dominant within Tenochtitlan, measured time through interconnected calendars that structured agricultural cycles. Specific festivals coincided with planting or harvest periods, embedding cultivation within sacred order. These observances required offerings of maize dough figures, flowers, and incense, all drawn from the land itself. Yet ritual did not replace toil, it accompanied it. In early spring, fields on the mainland required preparation distinct from chinampa cultivation. Dry soil demanded loosening before seeds could be introduced. Men and women worked in lines across communal plots, using wooden digging sticks to break clods and form raised mounds. The effort progressed slowly, each furrow shaped by individual exertion rather than animal traction. The absence of draft animals meant that every contour of farmland reflected human persistence. Communal labor obligations extended beyond one's assigned parcel. Kalpuli authorities organized collective tasks such as repairing irrigation ditches or reinforcing embankments along freshwater zones. Participation was expected, not only for the sake of productivity, but also as affirmation of belonging. Failure to contribute could result in loss of access to land, a consequence that carried profound implications for household survival. In regions bordering brackish water, engineers maintained dikes that separated saline and freshwater sections of the lakes. These barriers required constant inspection. Cracks formed where water pressure shifted, sediment accumulated in weak spots. Workers carried baskets of mud to reinforce vulnerable areas, often standing knee-deep in water for extended periods. Their labor preserved delicate balances upon which crops depended. Beyond the basin, tributary provinces supplied additional produce to the capital. In fertile valleys near Cuernavaca, farmers cultivated cacao and cotton in climates warmer than those of the highlands. These goods traveled along established routes toward the imperial center, where they supplemented local harvests. Tribute obligations added another layer of agricultural discipline across diverse ecological zones. Transporting produce required careful coordination. Canoes laden with vegetables navigated canals leading into central marketplaces. On land, porters carried goods using tumplines secured across their foreheads, distributing weight along the back. The journey could be lengthy, especially from distant communities, and freshness remained a priority. Delays meant spoilage. Storage practices reflected both abundance and risk. While chinampas produced multiple harvests annually, unpredictable weather could disrupt yields. Households constructed raised granaries to protect maize from dampness and pests. Woven reed bins lined with clay provided additional security. Preservation techniques, including drying and smoking certain crops, extended availability through lean months. Not all agricultural labor occurred in open fields. Within household compounds, small garden spaces cultivated herbs and medicinal plants. These patches contributed to dietary variety and healing practices. Knowledge of plant properties circulated through family instruction, creating intimate relationships between individuals and their immediate surroundings. Irrigation management demanded attentiveness to subtle changes in water clarity and flow. Excessive stagnation encouraged disease among crops. Insufficient moisture hindered growth. Farmers adjusted channels using simple barriers fashioned from wood and woven materials. The act required careful judgment developed through experience rather than written instruction. During particularly dry years, anxiety increased. Rains might arrive late, forcing delays in planting schedules. Communities sometimes performed additional ceremonies invoking deities associated with rain and fertility. Despite spiritual appeals, daily tasks continued. Soil had to be prepared in anticipation of eventual precipitation, even when skies remained cloudless. Children grew accustomed to agricultural routine from an early age. They accompanied elders into fields, carrying small baskets or assisting with lighter tasks. Through repetition, they internalized rhythms of planting and harvesting. Education occurred through observation and imitation, embedding practical knowledge within lived experience. Terraced fields along hillsides presented different challenges. Stone retaining walls required reinforcement after heavy rainfall. Soil washed downward had to be redistributed manually. Farmers climbed slopes repeatedly, balancing loads while maintaining careful footing. Erosion remained a constant threat, demanding vigilance each season. Crop diversity provided resilience. Amaranth, chili peppers, tomatoes, and various greens supplemented maize-based diets. Each species possessed distinct growth requirements and harvest times. Managing such variety necessitated awareness of staggered cycles, preventing simultaneous labor peaks that could overwhelm households. Market days in the Great Plaza of Tlatelolco revealed the outcome of countless hours spent in cultivation. Produce arranged in orderly displays testified to regional specialization. Buyers assessed quality by texture and color, selecting vegetables grown on chinampas renowned for their richness. Yet behind these vibrant scenes lay weeks of repetitive maintenance seldom acknowledged in the bustle of exchange. Insects presented persistent difficulties. Grasshoppers could decimate tender leaves if left unchecked. Farmers employed methods such as manual removal or the introduction of natural deterrents derived from local plants. These measures required patience and close inspection of each plot. Harvest season altered daily tempo. Maturing maize stalks were cut carefully and bundled for drying. Fields that had once appeared lush gradually transformed into orderly rows of trimmed stubble. Work extended into twilight hours, particularly when storms threatened. Timing remained critical. Premature harvest reduced yield, while delay invited loss. Processing harvested maize constituted an additional labor cycle. Ears were husked, kernels separated, and stores sorted according to intended use. Some portions were reserved for tribute, others for seed, and the remainder for household consumption. Allocation decisions carried weight, influencing sustenance until the following season. Certain agricultural tasks demanded cooperation beyond immediate kin. Construction of new chinampas, for instance, required significant manpower to gather reeds, transport mud, and secure boundary trees. Such projects could span weeks, gradually expanding cultivable area along the lake's margin. Expansion reflected demographic growth and ongoing demand. Weather patterns occasionally produced flooding that submerged low-lying plots. Recovery involved draining excess water and replanting where possible. Resilience depended upon diversified land holdings. Reliance upon a single plot heightened vulnerability. The relationship between agriculture and social hierarchy manifested subtly. Noble households often controlled larger or more strategically located parcels. They might oversee labor performed by commoners as part of tribute obligations. Nevertheless, even elite families relied upon the same fundamental processes of planting and harvest. Nightfall did not conclude agricultural responsibility entirely. Some individuals took turns guarding fields against animals attracted by ripening crops. Fires lit at the edges of plots deterred certain threats, casting gentle illumination across darkened terrain. These vigils reinforced connection to land even in hours of rest. Water transport extended beyond produce movement. Mud dredged from canals enriched chinampas, yet it also required relocation using small boats. Each load added fertility but demanded physical strength to maneuver through narrow waterways. Over years, accumulated experience refined techniques. Slight adjustments in mound spacing improved airflow around plants. Experimentation with intercropping increased efficiency. Such innovations emerged gradually, rooted in close familiarity with environment rather than formalized experimentation. In distant provinces near the Gulf Coast, humidity shaped entirely different agricultural rhythms. There, cacao trees thrived under dense canopy, requiring shade management distinct from highland maize cultivation. Tribute caravans connecting these regions to the capital demonstrated the ecological breadth encompassed by imperial oversight. Within the basin, however, everyday life remained tied to the interplay between lake and land. Morning mist rising from canals signaled another sequence of inspections, repairs, and adjustments. Hands moved methodically across familiar terrain, repeating gestures honed through repetition. No single harvest defined success. Continuity mattered more than abundance. Sustained yield across seasons preserved stability within households and Kalpuli communities alike. Agriculture was less an event than an ongoing negotiation with soil, water, and climate. Thus the year progressed, marked not by dramatic transformation, but by steady accumulation of effort. Fields shifted from preparation to growth, from growth to gathering, and back again. Each stage carried its own demands, yet none relieved the need for attention. Within this intricate web of obligation, Aztec agriculture revealed its most enduring characteristic: persistence. The labor might appear unremarkable from afar, yet it formed the quiet foundation upon which the basin's population depended. The mountains remained steadfast, the lakes shimmered with changing light, and across terraces and chinampas alike, cultivators continued their measured work, season after season. Fields beyond the horizon. At the outer edges of the basin, where the lakes narrowed into marsh and then gave way to firmer ground, cultivation assumed quieter forms. Here, far from the ceremonial heart of Tenochtitlan, the landscape felt less monumental and more intimate. Low stone dwellings clustered near springs. Smoke drifted in thin lines above thatched roofs. The rhythm of agriculture continued without spectacle. In these peripheral zones, households relied more heavily upon rain-fed plots known as temporal fields. Unlike chinampas sustained by constant moisture, these lands depended entirely upon seasonal precipitation. The soil hardened during dry months, forming a brittle surface that resisted penetration. When rains finally arrived, the scent of damp earth rose sharply, signaling a narrow window for sowing. Preparation for planting often began before the first storm cloud appeared. Farmers cleared brush and burned residual plant matter to enrich the soil with ash. The controlled fires moved slowly across fields, watched carefully to prevent unintended spread. This method required knowledge of wind direction and terrain contours, acquired through years of observation. In upland communities near the slopes of Popocatépetl, volcanic ash occasionally drifted across fields. Though disruptive in the moment, such deposits could renew fertility over time. Residents adapted by brushing accumulated ash from young plants and reinforcing terrace walls to withstand minor tremors. Living beneath an active mountain demanded attentiveness beyond agricultural routine. Livestock, as understood in later centuries, did not shape Aztec farming. There were no oxen drawing plows, no sheep grazing stubble. Instead, small animals such as turkeys and dogs occupied domestic spaces, contributing modestly to sustenance. Their presence required care, but did not significantly alter fieldwork practices. Human labor remained the primary force behind cultivation. In certain districts, maguey plants lined the borders of plots. Their thick leaves stored moisture, providing resilience during dry periods. Harvesting maguey for fibers and sap added another dimension to rural labor. Extracting sap involved scraping the interior cavity daily, collecting liquid that could be fermented into pulque. This process demanded regular attention over extended periods. Agricultural calendars varied slightly between regions due to microclimates. Valleys sheltered from wind warmed earlier in the year, allowing premature planting compared to exposed plateaus. Such differences influenced market timing, as early harvests commanded particular value. Farmers observed these variations closely, adjusting schedules accordingly. Land tenure systems reinforced continuity. Kalpuli authorities recorded allocations through memory and tradition rather than extensive written documentation. Boundaries were marked by natural features, distinctive rocks, specific trees, or changes in soil color. Knowledge of these markers passed from elders to younger generations during routine field visits. Certain crops required specialized care. Chili peppers demanded careful transplanting from seedbeds to larger plots once seedlings reached sufficient strength. This delicate procedure involved loosening roots without causing damage, then replanting into prepared holes. The work required steady hands and patience. Seasonal pests differed between lowland and upland areas. In marshy zones, rodents burrowed beneath mounds, disrupting root systems. Farmers set simple traps or reinforced soil with compacted mud. In drier regions, locust swarms posed periodic threats, descending unexpectedly and stripping foliage within hours. Communities sometimes organized collective efforts to drive them away using noise and smoke. Travel between agricultural communities fostered exchange of techniques. Canoes navigated interconnected waterways, while footpaths wound through hills. At regional gatherings, cultivators observed unfamiliar planting arrangements or irrigation adjustments, incorporating useful innovations into their own practices. This gradual diffusion of knowledge contributed to resilience across the empire. Tribute demands influenced cropping decisions in some areas. Regions obligated to supply specific goods devoted portions of land to mandated products. For example, communities near warmer southern frontiers cultivated cacao groves under shaded conditions. Tending these trees required pruning canopy branches to regulate light exposure. The fruit pods matured slowly, demanding months of vigilance before harvest. Storage architecture differed subtly across environments. In humid areas, granaries were elevated on stone supports to discourage rodents. In cooler highlands, thick-walled structures provided insulation against temperature fluctuation. Each design reflected adaptation to local conditions rather than uniform imperial directive. Ritual specialists occasionally visited rural districts to oversee agricultural ceremonies aligned with imperial calendars. Their presence reinforced connections between distant fields and the ceremonial center. Offerings placed at the edges of plots acknowledged both local spirits and broader cosmic forces. Yet these observances unfolded quietly, integrated into routine labor. Water sources beyond the lakes included springs emerging from rocky outcrops. Channels diverted spring water into small irrigation trenches that wound between plots. Maintenance required clearing sediment and plant debris, often accomplished with simple wooden implements. Disruption to a single trench could reduce moisture across multiple households' land. In forested margins, shifting cultivation occurred where soil fertility declined after years of planting. Families cleared new patches, allowing exhausted land to rest and regenerate. This rotation demanded careful planning to avoid overextension. Clearing involved cutting brush with obsidian-edged tools and stacking branches for drying before controlled burning. Obsidian itself played a role in agriculture beyond toolmaking. Sharp blades affixed to wooden handles facilitated harvesting of certain crops. Though fragile compared to metal, obsidian edges were remarkably precise. Craft specialists produced these implements in workshops, distributing them through market exchange. The monotony of fieldwork occasionally yielded moments of reflection. The distant silhouette of temples rising above the lake reminded cultivators of the broader society sustained by their efforts. Yet daily focus remained immediate: soil texture, leaf color, cloud formation. Grand narratives of conquest or tribute held little relevance when confronting weeds overtaking a row of maize. In areas bordering neighboring polities, agriculture sometimes intersected with defensive concerns. Watchposts overlooked fields vulnerable to raids. During periods of tension, farmers cultivated closer to settlements for security. Such adjustments altered patterns of land use, compressing activity into narrower zones. Harvest festivals in rural districts differed subtly from those in the capital. Local dances and offerings emphasized community bonds rather than imperial display. Agricultural tools were occasionally adorned with flowers during ceremonies, acknowledging their central role in survival. Women's responsibilities extended beyond seed selection and food preparation. In many communities, they managed small-scale trade of surplus produce in regional markets. Balancing baskets upon their backs, they traversed uneven paths to exchange vegetables or woven goods. This movement connected children's initiation into agricultural tasks intensified with age. By adolescence, many possessed deep familiarity with seasonal expectations. Knowledge was cumulative, layered through repeated exposure rather than formal instruction. Mistakes were corrected through demonstration and shared labor. In years of relative abundance, surplus produce supported craft specialization. Artisans could devote time to pottery, weaving, or tool production because fields provided sufficient nourishment. Conversely, lean seasons redirected attention entirely toward sustenance, narrowing social roles temporarily. Environmental variability remained constant. Sudden hailstorms could shred tender leaves within minutes. Extended drought reduced ear size and kernel density. Farmers responded through diversification, planting multiple crops with staggered maturation times to hedge against loss. Paths connecting upland and lowland regions facilitated not only trade, but also cultural exchange. Songs and stories carried agricultural themes, embedding practical knowledge within oral tradition. Although unwritten, these narratives reinforced seasonal awareness and communal identity. In distant eastern provinces near the Gulf Coast, humidity fostered entirely different vegetation. There, cultivation integrated with tropical forest management. Clearing canopy required coordinated effort, and regrowth occurred rapidly if neglected. Tribute caravans traversing these landscapes faced challenges distinct from those encountered in the basin. Back within highland districts, the evening air cooled quickly after sunset. Farmers returning from fields carried tools across shoulders, leaving plots momentarily unattended. Stars emerged above mountain ridges, guiding timing for the following day. Familiar constellations signaled seasonal transition as reliably as any calendar. Agriculture beyond the horizon of the capital revealed diversity often overshadowed by narratives centered upon monumental architecture. Each valley, slope, and marsh contributed uniquely to the imperial mosaic. Yet everywhere, the fundamental pattern persisted: preparation, planting, maintenance, harvest, and renewal. Through persistent adaptation to microclimates and terrain, rural communities sustained populations far larger than earlier generations might have imagined possible. Their methods did not rely upon sudden transformation, but upon attentive continuity. Soil received seeds. Water nourished roots. Hands intervened where imbalance threatened. Across scattered settlements, the quiet dedication of cultivators formed an invisible network stretching from mountain slopes to coastal plains. The empire's grandeur rested upon this dispersed foundation, built through countless repetitive gestures carried out beneath open sky. The weight of obligation. Within the expanding dominion often described as the Aztec Empire, agriculture did not function solely as a means of sustenance. It operated as an instrument of obligation. Fields produced not only food for households but also tribute for distant authorities, offerings for temples, and reserves for times of scarcity. Each kernel harvested carried layers of expectation beyond immediate consumption. In communities surrounding Texcoco, administrators maintained careful awareness of yields. While no uniform written census documented every ear of maize, tribute collectors possessed detailed knowledge of what each district could reasonably provide. Their assessments accounted for soil fertility, rainfall patterns, and the number of households cultivating land. Expectations were rarely arbitrary. They reflected accumulated experience. Tribute arrived in measured quantities: bundles of maize, baskets of beans, dried chilies strung together for ease of transport. Porters advanced along causeways and footpaths toward the central cities, their pace steady and deliberate. The journey itself formed part of the agricultural cycle, linking remote fields to urban storehouses. Storehouses within ceremonial precincts served as repositories of abundance. Their interiors remained cool and dim, designed to protect reserves from moisture and pests. Officials oversaw allocation, ensuring that tribute supported festivals, feeding of laborers engaged in construction, and redistribution during hardship. Agriculture, therefore, extended beyond cultivation into administration. Some lands were designated as tekpantlali, fields reserved for the support of nobility and state functions. These parcels were often among the most fertile, situated near reliable water sources. Laborers assigned to them worked according to schedules determined by elite households. Although similar techniques were employed as in communal plots, the produce followed a distinct path upon harvest. The presence of military campaigns influenced agricultural rhythms. When warriors departed for distant regions, labor burdens shifted within their home communities. Elderly individuals and younger members compensated where possible, redistributing tasks to maintain planting schedules. Fields could not remain unattended simply because conflict unfolded elsewhere. Environmental management extended into forestry. Certain wooded areas were preserved deliberately to ensure availability of timber for construction and fuel. Cutting occurred selectively, guided by communal oversight. Wood played a vital role in tool production and domestic life, reinforcing interdependence between cultivated and uncultivated spaces. Soil exhaustion posed gradual challenges. Continuous maize planting depleted nutrients unless replenished. In chinampa zones, dredged lake sediment restored fertility naturally. On upland plots, fallowing allowed recovery, though this practice reduced immediate output. Decisions regarding rotation balanced short-term needs with long-term sustainability. Craft production intersected with agriculture in subtle ways. Pottery workshops relied upon clay deposits often located near cultivated areas. Farmers sometimes extracted clay during off-peak seasons, supplementing income or fulfilling communal obligations. The dual role blurred distinctions between cultivator and artisan. Water management within the basin required large-scale coordination. The construction of the Great Dike attributed to Nezahualcóyotl exemplified such efforts. By separating saline and freshwater sections of the lake system, the barrier protected agricultural zones from encroaching salinity. Maintenance of this structure demanded periodic collective labor, drawing participants from multiple communities. Climatic irregularities occasionally strained the system. Extended drought diminished reservoir levels, exposing mudflats previously submerged. Farmers adjusted by deepening canals or concentrating cultivation in more reliable areas. These adaptations required planning and physical endurance. Disease among crops could spread rapidly if undetected. Fungal infections manifested as discoloration or shriveled kernels. Observant cultivators removed affected plants to prevent contagion. Although lacking modern scientific terminology, they recognized patterns linking moisture, temperature, and plant health. Religious institutions owned land as well. Temple estates provided sustenance for priests and ceremonial attendants. Laborers assigned to these lands cultivated according to sacred calendars, ensuring that offerings remained plentiful during festival cycles. Harvested produce might be processed specifically for ritual consumption rather than market sale. Markets beyond the capital mirrored its complexity on a smaller scale. In towns scattered throughout the Valley of Mexico, weekly exchanges facilitated redistribution of surplus. Agricultural products competed with crafted goods for attention, yet their steady presence underlined foundational importance. Migration influenced cultivation patterns. Families relocating from less fertile zones sought plots within more productive districts, sometimes integrating into established Calpulli networks. Acceptance required negotiation of obligations, reinforcing communal cohesion while accommodating demographic change. Agricultural knowledge traveled alongside these movements. Techniques refined in one region enriched practices elsewhere. The empire functioned as a conduit for such exchange, though variations persisted according to local ecology. Fishing supplemented plant-based diets, particularly within lake communities. Nets cast into canals yielded small fish and amphibians. Though not agriculture in the strictest sense, aquatic harvesting complemented chinampa cultivation, demonstrating integration of water resources into subsistence strategies. Processing areas near fields revealed another layer of routine. Stones used for grinding maize accumulated where patterns over years of constant motion. Replacement required quarrying and shaping, tasks often undertaken during agricultural lulls. Tool maintenance thus formed part of seasonal planning. Imperial expansion introduced new crops to certain regions. Where climate permitted, experimentation with unfamiliar plants occurred cautiously. Success depended upon careful observation of soil response and water availability. Not every introduction thrived. Failures were noted and abandoned without fanfare. Taxation in kind meant that poor harvests could reverberate through political structures. Reduced tribute challenged storehouse reserves, compelling adjustments in distribution. Authorities sometimes moderated demands during severe shortages, recognizing that over-extraction jeopardized long-term productivity. Women's expertise in processing remained indispensable. The daily transformation of maize into dough required hours of grinding and kneading. This repetitive motion shaped bodily endurance, linking domestic space to distant fields through invisible labor. Agricultural surplus supported specialized education among elite youth. Kalmakak schools relied upon steady food supply to sustain students dedicated to priestly and administrative training. Thus, even intellectual pursuits rested upon unceasing cultivation. In marginal lands near volcanic rock outcrops, soil depth limited planting options. Farmers constructed small raised beds filled with transported earth, creating pockets of fertility amid stone. Such efforts demonstrated determination to extract sustenance from challenging terrain. Seasonal migration of labor occasionally occurred during peak tasks such as large-scale terrace repair. Neighboring communities cooperated, exchanging assistance that would be reciprocated later. This mutual aid reduced strain on individual households. The empire's road network facilitated tribute transport, but also enabled oversight. Officials traveling between regions observed field conditions, noting signs of neglect or abundance. Their reports informed administrative decisions affecting resource allocation. Weather prediction relied upon accumulated experience with cloud formations and wind shifts. Observers noted subtle changes in the horizon's coloration before storms. Although uncertainty remained, such attentiveness reduced surprise. Agriculture also intersected with legal structures. Disputes over boundaries or water access were resolved through communal deliberation. Elders familiar with long-standing markers contributed memory-based testimony, preserving continuity in land tenure. Beyond subsistence and tribute, fields contributed to social identity. Ownership and stewardship of land signified belonging. Ceremonies marking transitions between life stages often referenced agricultural metaphors, reinforcing connection between human growth and crop cycles. As twilight settled over terraced hills and lake margins alike, the day's exertions concluded quietly. Tools were stored, canals inspected one final time, and granaries secured. Within the vast imperial framework, countless individuals repeated similar routines across dispersed landscapes. The weight of obligation rested gently yet persistently upon shoulders accustomed to carrying it. Agriculture demanded consistency rather than spectacle. Through steady adherence to seasonal patterns, communities maintained equilibrium within an ever-expanding polity. Long after tribute caravans reached urban storehouses and ceremonial fires burned within temple precincts, the essential work continued in distant plots. Soil received seeds once more, and hands resumed their measured tasks beneath shifting skies. Labor within the city's shadow. Along the southern edge of the great island city, where canals widened and converged before meeting the open lake, cultivation pressed closely against dense habitation. The neighborhood of Tenochtitlan, known as Xochimilco, had long been associated with fertile chinampas, yet its fields were not untouched by the presence of urban life. The proximity of temples, palaces, and crowded dwellings altered the tempo of agricultural routine. Here, movement began even earlier than in outlying districts. Canoes slid through waterways crowded with traffic, navigating between fishermen, traders, and transporters of construction materials. Farmers guided their vessels carefully, balancing bundles of seedlings or baskets filled with composted lake sediment. The canals were narrow arteries, and a misjudged turn could upset both cargo and schedule. Urban waste management intersected with cultivation in subtle ways. Organic refuse from households and marketplaces was sometimes collected and repurposed as fertilizer. Though unremarkable in appearance, this recycling contributed to soil enrichment. Workers layered decomposed material onto chinampas, integrating the city's byproducts into the cycle of growth. Gardens nearest residential clusters were often smaller but intensely managed. Space limitations encouraged precision. Plants were arranged tightly yet thoughtfully to maximize yield. Beds of amaranth alternated with medicinal herbs, while flowering species attracted pollinators beneficial to adjacent vegetables. The careful arrangement reflected an intimate understanding of plant relationships. Noise from the city carried across the water, distant drumbeats from ceremonial precincts, rhythmic sounds of construction, and the murmur of market exchange. Despite these distractions, cultivators maintained concentration. Their focus lay on leaf texture, soil moisture, and the condition of irrigation channels. Noise from the city carried across the water, distant drumbeats from ceremonial precincts, rhythmic sounds of construction, and the murmur of market exchange. Despite these distractions, cultivators maintained concentration. Their focus lay on leaf texture, soil moisture, and the condition of irrigation channels. Water quality required constant attention in densely populated zones. Runoff from habitation could alter nutrient balance within canals. Farmers monitored changes in color and scent, adjusting dredging patterns to maintain productivity. Silt removed from waterways was spread evenly, avoiding overaccumulation that might suffocate root systems. Land tenure within urban peripheries was sometimes more complex than in rural areas. Nobles and temple institutions possessed plots interwoven among communal holdings. Coordination of planting schedules and irrigation access demanded negotiation, overseen by local authorities to prevent conflict. In these neighborhoods, agricultural tasks intertwined with craft specialization. Families might alternate between fieldwork and weaving, pottery, or feather artistry. The flexibility of labor allocation depended upon season. During peak planting and harvest periods, fields commanded priority. When growth stabilized, attention shifted temporarily toward artisanal production. Market demand influenced crop selection near the capital. Certain vegetables and herbs commanded higher exchange value due to culinary preferences among elites. Farmers experimented with cultivating varieties distinguished by size or flavor. Success depended upon careful seed selection and attentive cultivation. The chinampas system in southern districts exhibited remarkable density. Narrow canals divided elongated plots reinforced by ahujote trees whose roots anchored soil firmly. These trees required periodic pruning to prevent excessive shade. Cut branches served as fuel or construction material, ensuring nothing was wasted. Irrigation patterns in urban-adjacent fields differed subtly from those in more remote areas. Water levels fluctuated due to increased boat traffic and infrastructural modifications. Cultivators adapted by raising plot surfaces incrementally, adding layers of mud to maintain optimal height above canal level. Young apprentices trained under experienced relatives, learning to judge when to transplant seedlings by the firmness of stems and coloration of leaves. Instruction unfolded quietly through demonstration and correction during shared labor. Skills developed gradually, shaped by tactile familiarity. During certain festivals, agricultural produce from nearby chinampas was selected for ceremonial display. Perfectly formed maize ears, vibrant chili clusters, and fragrant blossoms adorned altars. While such moments highlighted aesthetic qualities of crops, the majority of harvest remained destined for ordinary consumption. The close presence of governing institutions occasionally resulted in requisition of labor for public works. Farmers might be summoned to assist in reinforcing causeways or dredging canals beyond their immediate plots. These obligations required temporary redirection of effort, but were integrated into expectations of citizenship within the imperial capital. Environmental hazards within the basin included periodic algal blooms that disrupted canal ecosystems. When water quality declined, cultivators intensified dredging and adjusted planting density to reduce stress upon crops. The adaptability of the chinampas system relied upon continuous human intervention. Food preparation within city households reflected diversity made possible by proximate agriculture. Fresh vegetables reached kitchens within hours of harvest, preserving flavor and nutritional value. Grinding stones worked steadily each evening, transforming maize into dough that would be shaped into tortillas. Urban agriculture also supported medicinal practice. Healers sought specific plants grown in controlled garden beds. Cultivators responsible for these species monitored growth attentively, ensuring availability for treatment of illness. Such gardens formed quiet sanctuaries amid bustling surroundings. Social stratification manifested subtly in proximity to the ceremonial center. Plots closer to temple precincts often belonged to higher status families or institutions. Yet regardless of ownership, the labor required remained fundamentally similar: digging, weeding, irrigating. Flood management presented ongoing challenges. Heavy rains combined with lake-level fluctuations threatened to inundate low-lying chinampas. Farmers responded by reinforcing edges with woven barriers and adding layers of sediment. These incremental adjustments accumulated over years, gradually elevating plots. Observation of celestial patterns continued even within urban districts. Agricultural timing remained tied to seasonal shifts signaled by star positions and daylight length. Although temple priests maintained formal calendars, practical awareness resided in the eyes of cultivators watching the sky at dusk. Wastewater from dyeing workshops and other crafts occasionally entered canals, altering composition. When such contamination affected plant health, complaints traveled through communal channels, prompting regulation. The balance between industry and cultivation required oversight to prevent long-term damage. In quieter hours before sunrise, mist drifted between closely spaced plots, softening outlines of trees and houses. The city's monumental architecture appeared distant and muted from water level. Within this hushed atmosphere, farmers began their inspections, touching leaves still cool from night air. Seasonal labor peaks strained even densely populated districts. Harvest required coordinated effort to transport produce swiftly before spoilage. Canoes lined up along canal edges, loaded methodically to maintain balance. Routes toward marketplaces were well known, yet congestion demanded patience. Agricultural resilience near the capital contributed directly to political stability. Reliable food supply reduced unrest and ensured continuity of ritual life. Storehouses replenished from nearby fields provided buffers during lean periods in distant provinces. At times, construction projects encroached upon cultivable land. Expansion of residential areas or ceremonial structures reduced available space. Farmers compensated by intensifying production on remaining plots, refining techniques to extract maximum yield from limited area. The physical toll of continuous kneeling and lifting shaped bodies accustomed to endurance. Muscles adapted to repetitive motion, and calloused hands bore silent testimony to daily exertion. Despite proximity to wealth and splendor, agricultural life remained grounded in modest persistence. As dusk descended, reflections of torchlight shimmered upon canal surfaces. Urban sounds softened gradually, replaced by gentle lapping of water against chinampa edges. Cultivators secured tools and prepared for another cycle beginning before first light. Within the city's shadow, agriculture persisted not as backdrop, but as essential infrastructure. The grandeur of imperial ceremonies relied upon vegetables grown within sight of temple spires. Quiet diligence in narrow waterways sustained a population whose scale might otherwise have seemed impossible. Thus, even amid dense habitation and political authority, the fundamental pattern endured. Soil received care, water required management, and hands returned daily to familiar tasks, distant provinces, and subtle variations. Far beyond the shimmering lakes of the Central Valley, agricultural life unfolded across landscapes shaped by humidity, wind, and shifting soil. In coastal regions near the Gulf, dense vegetation pressed close to cultivated clearings. Moist air carried the scent of salt and earth, and rainfall arrived with greater frequency than in the highlands. Farmers in these territories worked within a different ecological rhythm, though their obligations to the imperial center remained firmly in place. In warm lowlands approaching Veracruz, cacao orchards stretched beneath partial canopy. Shade trees were deliberately preserved to protect delicate pods from harsh sunlight. Pruning required careful judgment, ensuring filtered light reached the trunks without exposing them entirely. The harvest cycle extended over months, with ripe pods cut individually using obsidian blades attached to wooden handles. Unlike maize, cacao demanded fermentation and drying before transport. Beans were spread across woven mats beneath open sky, turned periodically to ensure even exposure. Sudden rainstorms posed a constant risk, prompting swift collection and sheltering. This vigilance reflected both economic value and tribute expectations tied to imperial demands. Further south, in regions bordering tropical forest, slash-and-burn cultivation remained prevalent. Clearing dense undergrowth required coordinated effort with stone axes and controlled fires. Once ash settled, seeds were pressed into fertile ground enriched by charred vegetation. These fields yielded for several seasons before fertility declined, encouraging rotation to new plots. The humid climate encouraged rapid regrowth, meaning fallow land soon reclaimed by forest. Farmers navigated a delicate balance between cultivation and natural succession. Paths through underbrush connected temporary clearings to permanent villages constructed upon slightly elevated terrain safe from seasonal flooding. On the Pacific coast, proximity to the ocean influenced subsistence patterns. While agriculture remained primary, marine resources supplemented diets. Salt production occurred along certain shorelines, where seawater evaporated within shallow basins. This mineral entered trade networks, supporting preservation of foodstuffs transported inland. Highland provinces distant from the basin experienced cooler temperatures and shorter growing seasons. In valleys near Tlaxcala, terraces carved into slopes captured scarce moisture. Stone-lined channels diverted runoff from seasonal rains into reservoirs positioned strategically above fields. Gravity-fed irrigation systems required periodic clearing to prevent obstruction by debris. In arid northern frontiers, soil composition differed markedly from the volcanic richness of central zones. Sandy textures demanded frequent addition of organic matter to retain moisture. Farmers collected plant residues and animal droppings, incorporating them into mounds to enhance fertility. Crops grew more slowly, and yields fluctuated widely depending upon rainfall. Distance from imperial centers influenced local autonomy in agricultural decision-making. While tribute quotas remained fixed, daily methods varied according to environmental necessity. Provincial leaders interpreted obligations flexibly when confronted with drought or pest outbreaks, adjusting internal distribution to safeguard survival. Transport from remote areas required complex logistics. Caravans composed of porters moved along established routes, resting at way stations equipped with modest storage facilities. Agricultural goods traveled alongside crafted items and textiles, forming diverse cargo bound for administrative hubs. In mountainous regions, narrow valleys confined cultivable land to small strips along riverbanks. Here, flood cycles deposited nutrient-rich sediment, yet also threatened crops with sudden inundation. Farmers constructed modest embankments reinforced with woven branches to moderate flow. Certain provinces cultivated crops unfamiliar to highland farmers. Vanilla vines climbed tree trunks in humid forests, requiring manual pollination to ensure fruit development. Harvesting these slender pods demanded patience, as ripening occurred unevenly. Such specialized products enriched imperial markets, expanding culinary and ritual diversity. Communities situated near mineral deposits sometimes divided labor seasonally between agriculture and extraction. During planting and harvest, fields commanded priority. In intervening months, men might journey to quarry stone or mine pigments, supplementing household resources. In some territories, political tensions with neighboring states affected farming practices. Fields closer to contested boundaries were cultivated cautiously, with watch posts established nearby. The uncertainty of potential raids influenced crop selection, favoring varieties with shorter maturation periods. Cultural diversity across provinces shaped agricultural rituals. Although imperial calendars provided overarching structure, local ceremonies reflected distinct traditions predating incorporation into the empire. Offerings varied in composition, incorporating regionally significant plants and symbolic objects. Trade routes linking coastal and highland regions facilitated exchange of seeds. Over time, maize varieties adapted to distinct climates spread gradually across territories. Selective cultivation produced strains suited to local conditions, demonstrating dynamic interaction between environment and human choice. Irrigation technology exhibited notable variation. In certain southern valleys, stone aqueducts transported water from upland springs across uneven terrain. Maintenance of these structures required skilled stonework and communal coordination, integrating agricultural necessity with with architectural expertise. In marshlands beyond the central basin, chinampa-like techniques emerged independently, though differing in construction. Instead of willow reinforcement, farmers utilized locally available tree species whose roots stabilized soil. Such adaptations underscored ingenuity shaped by resource availability. Drought cycles occasionally coincided across multiple provinces, straining tribute systems. When shortages extended widely, imperial storehouses relied upon accumulated reserves. Distribution policies sought to prevent unrest, though scarcity inevitably tested resilience. Provincial marketplaces displayed regional character. Along coastal areas, baskets overflowed with tropical fruits alongside maize and beans. In upland towns, hardy root vegetables and dried chilies dominated stalls. Despite variation, the underlying labor mirrored that of Central Valley farmers: patient, repetitive, attentive. Climate anomalies such as unseasonal frost affected highland fields unexpectedly. Farmers responded by covering vulnerable seedlings with woven mats during cold nights. These protective measures required foresight and rapid action, often involving entire households. In forested frontiers, wildlife interactions posed additional challenges. Deer and other animals foraged at field edges, necessitating fences woven from branches. Vigilance extended into nighttime hours, with subtle noises signaling intrusion. Agricultural calendars adjusted to regional rainfall patterns. Some provinces experienced bimodal precipitation, enabling 2 distinct planting cycles annually. Managing these opportunities required careful sequencing of labor to avoid exhaustion. Administrative oversight from the imperial center did not eliminate local expertise. Provincial farmers retained deep understanding of their terrain, drawing upon generational memory. Tribute collectors depended upon this knowledge when estimating feasible contributions. In estuarine environments where rivers met the sea, soil salinity demanded special management. Farmers flushed fields with fresh water when available, preventing salt accumulation harmful to crops. Timing such irrigation required awareness of tidal patterns. Ceremonial exchange between provinces and the capital often featured agricultural symbolism. Baskets woven in coastal styles arrived filled with highland maize, representing interconnected sustenance networks across varied geographies. Education within provincial communities mirrored that of central districts, though shaped by local ecology. Children learned to identify subtle differences in leaf coloration indicating nutrient deficiency specific to their region. This intimate familiarity fostered resilience amid environmental unpredictability. As twilight settled over distant mountains or humid coastal plains, cultivators concluded their tasks beneath skies distinct from those of the basin. Yet despite differences in climate and terrain, a shared discipline connected them. Seeds were placed carefully, water guided deliberately, and harvests gathered with measured care. Across expansive territory, Aztec agriculture revealed itself as a mosaic of environments unified by obligation and ingenuity. Each province contributed uniquely to imperial sustenance, adapting techniques to suit terrain while maintaining steady dedication to routine labor. Thus, in valleys far removed from the ceremonial heart, hands continued their patient work. The empire's breadth rested upon countless localized adjustments, each shaped by soil, climate, and communal memory. Through quiet perseverance, cycles of scarcity and resilience. There were years when the sky withheld its generosity. Clouds gathered along the horizon, yet dissolved before releasing rain. The earth hardened, and fine cracks spread across exposed ground like delicate lines etched into clay. In such seasons, agricultural labor acquired a quieter urgency, shaped not by abundance, but by careful conservation. Within the Valley of Mexico, fluctuating lake levels revealed mudflats rarely visible during wetter cycles. Canoes that once glided smoothly through canals scraped against shallows. Chinampa farmers responded by dredging deeper channels, lifting heavy baskets of sediment to restore navigability and preserve moisture around plant roots. The work required sustained effort under a relentless sun. In upland districts where rainfall normally nourished maize fields, seedlings emerged unevenly. Some rows stood sparse, their green blades separated by empty soil. Farmers replanted where possible, pressing remaining seeds into ground still capable of sustaining life. Decisions about allocation became delicate. Seed reserved for future cycles could not be spent carelessly. Storehouses gained heightened significance during such times. Granaries constructed in previous years now offered measured relief. Distribution within Kalpuli communities followed established patterns, ensuring that households received portions proportional to need and obligation. Moderation governed these transfers, as reserves had to endure uncertain duration. Fishing and foraging supplemented diets when cultivated produce diminished. Along receding lake edges, families collected small aquatic organisms trapped in shallow pools. Edible greens that grew wild near water sources gained prominence in meals. Knowledge of seasonal plants beyond cultivated species proved invaluable. The social fabric of agricultural communities faced subtle strain under scarcity. Labor remained constant, yet yields did not always reflect exertion. Patience became as necessary as physical strength. Ritual observances seeking favorable weather intensified, though fields still required tending regardless of expectation. In certain provinces, frost arrived earlier than anticipated, darkening maize leaves before full maturation. Harvest occurred prematurely to salvage what remained viable. Ears smaller than usual filled baskets, reminding cultivators of vulnerability inherent in reliance upon climate. Drought influenced livestock care as well. Turkeys dependent upon grain feed required careful rationing. Households adjusted portions to extend supplies. These choices reflected interconnectedness between crop output and domestic sustenance. Trade routes became conduits for balancing regional disparities. Provinces experiencing relative abundance exchanged surplus for goods from harder-hit areas. Imperial oversight facilitated such movement, though logistical challenges remained significant across varied terrain. Water management strategies grew increasingly sophisticated during prolonged dryness. In certain areas near Chalco, communities expanded small reservoirs designed to capture rainfall during brief storms. Earthen embankments reinforced with woven vegetation held collected water for gradual release into fields. Agricultural calendars adapted reluctantly to shifting conditions. Planting dates adjusted slightly in response to delayed precipitation, though tradition constrained flexibility. Experience guided these modifications, balancing respect for inherited cycles with practical necessity. The psychological dimension of scarcity cannot be separated from physical labor. Fields requiring identical attention, as in prosperous years, now yielded less. Yet routine persisted: weed removal, canal clearing, soil mounding. Such continuity provided structure amid uncertainty. In forested southern provinces, rainfall variability manifested differently. Excessive precipitation occasionally replaced drought as challenge, saturating soil and encouraging fungal growth. Farmers responded by increasing spacing between plants to improve airflow, reducing disease spread. Crop diversification mitigated risk. Households that cultivated multiple species fared better when one failed. Amaranth often demonstrated resilience under marginal conditions, providing valuable nutrition when maize yields faltered. Communal feasts became more modest during lean periods, yet their occurrence reinforced solidarity. Shared meals, though simpler, affirmed collective endurance. Agricultural identity extended beyond abundance into shared perseverance. Terrace maintenance intensified during heavy rain years following drought. Soil loosened by dryness eroded rapidly when precipitation returned. Stones displaced by runoff required repositioning to prevent further degradation. Recovery demanded effort equal to initial construction. In some regions, migrating groups sought temporary refuge in more fertile valleys. Movement altered demographic patterns, increasing pressure upon host communities' fields. Negotiations regarding land use required sensitivity to both necessity and long-term sustainability. The empire's administrative apparatus monitored such fluctuations closely. Tribute assessments adjusted when widespread hardship threatened overall stability. While obligations rarely vanished entirely, measured reduction prevented collapse of local productivity. Seed preservation during scarcity held particular importance. Families safeguarded portions of harvest designated for future planting, even when immediate hunger tempted consumption. Clay containers stored in cool, dry spaces protected kernels from spoilage. These reserves represented hope for renewal. Environmental signs provided subtle guidance. The behavior of certain birds, the flowering of particular plants, and the clarity of distant mountain outlines offered clues about approaching weather patterns. Farmers observed these indicators with renewed attentiveness during uncertain cycles. Agricultural tools required maintenance regardless of yield. Digging sticks hardened by fire eventually splintered and needed replacement. Obsidian blades dulled through repeated use. Crafting new implements consumed time that might otherwise have been devoted to field expansion, yet neglecting tools risked inefficiency. In remote highlands near Aztec, snowmelt contributed modestly to irrigation streams during certain years. Farmers tracked these flows carefully, diverting water through narrow channels to sustain limited plots. Seasonal melt patterns influenced planting density and crop selection. Cultural memory preserved accounts of previous droughts and famines. Elders recalled strategies that had proven effective decades earlier, advising cautious planting or diversified cropping. Such recollections functioned as informal archives guiding response to contemporary challenges. Markets reflected scarcity through subtle shifts. Prices of staple goods rose gradually, measured in cacao beans or other exchange mediums. Buyers adjusted consumption accordingly, prioritizing essentials over luxury items. Despite hardship, agricultural innovation occasionally emerged from necessity. Experiments with deeper mounds retained moisture longer. Mulching with dried plant material reduced evaporation. These adjustments required additional labor, yet offered modest improvement. Ritual calendars continued uninterrupted, though offerings sometimes diminished in quantity. Symbolic gestures retained significance even when material abundance waned. Agricultural deities remained central to communal consciousness. Recovery often occurred gradually rather than dramatically. A season of adequate rainfall restored confidence incrementally. Fields once parched regained color, and granaries began to refill. The experience of scarcity lingered, influencing future decisions about storage and diversification. Children who matured during difficult years internalized lessons of restraint and attentiveness. Their understanding of agriculture encompassed not only technique but also prudence. Memory of lean seasons shaped future planning. Through cycles of hardship and renewal, resilience became woven into agricultural identity. Productivity could not be taken for granted. It had to be nurtured through vigilance and cooperation. Communities learned to anticipate variability, adjusting methods while maintaining foundational routines. Thus, even when sky and soil conspired to challenge expectation, cultivators persisted. The rhythm slowed at times, accelerated at others, yet never ceased entirely. In the interplay between scarcity and sustenance, Aztec agriculture revealed its enduring capacity for adaptation grounded in patient, measured labor. The final harvest before the turning. In the years just before unfamiliar sails appeared along distant shores, the agricultural world of central Mexico continued in its accustomed cadence. Fields were prepared as they had been for generations. Seeds were chosen with deliberation. Water moved through canals guided by hands that understood its temperament. The empire stood vast, yet its foundation remained rooted in soil and season. Around the southern lakes, chinampas reached a density unmatched in earlier times. Plots extended outward in careful sequence, their edges reinforced with ahujote trunks grown thick from decades of pruning. Canoes traveled narrow corridors between green walls of maize and amaranth, their passage so familiar that even in dim light the route required little thought. In districts near Coyoacán, farmers experimented with adjusting planting intervals to increase airflow between stalks. Experience had revealed that crowded rows encouraged disease during humid periods. Wider spacing reduced yield per area, but improved overall harvest stability. Such decisions reflected measured calculation rather than haste. Temple estates continued to cultivate ceremonial crops reserved for specific observances. Certain varieties of maize distinguished by unusual coloration were grown exclusively for ritual dough figures. Their cultivation required isolation from other strains to preserve purity. Careful attention to seed separation ensured continuity of these sacred forms. Beyond the basin, provincial landscapes followed their own cycles. In fertile valleys to the south, cotton fields rippled beneath warm breezes. Harvesting cotton demanded patience as fibers were plucked individually from dried bolls. The process stained fingers and required repetitive motion sustained for hours. Once gathered, fibers were cleaned and spun, linking agricultural output to textile production. Irrigation networks constructed generations earlier remained central to stability. Channels carved into earth and stone required desilting at regular intervals. Teams moved methodically along their length, removing debris that could impede flow. This maintenance was neither dramatic nor celebrated, yet neglect would have jeopardized entire harvests. Administrative records preserved in painted codices tracked tribute obligations in symbolic form. Glyphs representing maize, beans, and textiles indicated quantities expected from particular provinces. While these images lacked numerical precision by modern standards, they conveyed clear expectations understood by officials and local leaders alike. Seasonal winds carried dust from exposed hillsides into cultivated areas. Farmers responded by constructing low barriers of woven reeds to reduce soil displacement. These structures, though modest, protected tender seedlings from abrasion. Within household compounds, storage jars stood arranged in cool interior spaces. Clay vessels sealed with fitted lids safeguarded dried chilies and beans against moisture. The careful organization of these stores reflected foresight, shaped by memory of past uncertainty. Agricultural education extended through formal institutions as well. In Kalmakak schools, noble youth studied not only ritual and governance, but also principles of land management. Their instruction included observation of chinampa construction and terrace repair, reinforcing awareness that political authority depended upon agricultural competence. Trade between regions continued steadily. Caravans transported cacao from humid lowlands to highland markets, exchanging it for obsidian tools crafted near volcanic sources. These exchanges reinforced interdependence across varied ecologies. Near the slopes of Nevado de Toluca, farmers cultivated hardy maize adapted to cooler elevations. The shorter growing season required careful timing of planting to avoid early frost. Snow visible upon distant peaks served as reminder of climatic limits shaping daily decisions. In marshy northern districts, reeds harvested from wetlands were woven into mats used for drying grain. This craft depended upon sustainable management of aquatic plants. Cutting occurred in rotational patterns to allow regrowth, preserving future supply. Market inspectors monitored fairness in exchange. Standardized baskets ensured consistency in measurement of grain. Though simple in design, these containers provided reference points that reduced dispute. Agricultural produce thus entered economic systems structured by customary regulation. As years progressed, subtle signs of strain emerged within certain provinces subject to heavy tribute demands. Soil fertility declined in overworked fields where fallowing had been reduced to meet quotas. Some communities quietly negotiated temporary relief, emphasizing long-term sustainability over immediate extraction. Wildlife patterns shifted gradually as cultivated land expanded. Birds adapted to new habitats created by maize fields, feeding upon insects stirred by human activity. Farmers tolerated some presence, recognizing ecological balance, yet remained vigilant against excessive loss. Ritual calendars continued to mark transition between planting and harvest with measured ceremony. Offerings placed upon altars symbolized gratitude and hope. Even as imperial ambitions extended outward, agricultural observance remained grounded in local soil. In the final seasons before profound transformation, few could foresee the magnitude of change approaching from across the ocean. Reports of distant strangers circulated faintly along trade routes, yet fields required attention regardless of rumor. The immediacy of weeding and irrigation overshadowed distant uncertainty. Near coastal frontiers, fishermen observed unfamiliar vessels upon the horizon. Inland cultivators, however, continued their routines uninterrupted. Maize matured under sun that had warmed these valleys for centuries. Environmental stewardship persisted as quiet discipline. Woodlets were trimmed selectively. Irrigation channels were inspected at dawn and dusk. Seeds were sorted by size and color to ensure strong germination in the following cycle. In urban districts, expansion pressed further into peripheral farmland. Some chinampas were repurposed to support construction, reducing cultivated area. Farmers responded by intensifying care on remaining plots, maintaining productivity despite spatial constraint. The physical landscape bore traces of generations who had shaped it through cumulative labor. Terraces layered upon hillsides, dikes spanning lake sections, and networks of canals testified to persistent human engagement with environment. As harvest approached during those final undisturbed years, fields across the empire ripened simultaneously in varied hues. Maize tassels shimmered in late-season light. Cotton bolls dried beneath warm skies. Cacao pods darkened within shaded groves. Gathering proceeded with practiced efficiency. Bundles were carried to storage, portions set aside for tribute, others reserved for seed. The sequence unfolded without awareness that future cycles would soon confront unprecedented disruption. Agricultural life had always contained uncertainty, drought, frost, pestilence. Yet these were fluctuations within a familiar framework. The system had endured for generations through adaptation and cooperation. On the eve of transformation, the empire's sustenance remained anchored in fields shaped by human hands and guided by inherited knowledge. Water flowed through canals as it had before. Tools rested beside granaries after long days of labor. Communities prepared quietly for the next planting season, trusting in patterns that had sustained them across centuries. The turning would arrive soon, altering landscapes and lives in ways beyond anticipation. Yet within this final harvest before that shift, the essence of Aztec agriculture stood clear, persistent, attentive, interwoven with belief and obligation. Soil received care, water responded to guidance, and hands continued their measured work beneath expansive sky. After the first footsteps, dawn mist rose gently from the surface of the Great Lake as unfamiliar animals lowered their heads to drink along its edge. Their hooves disturbed the shallow reeds, leaving impressions deeper than those of any deer known in the region. Word of their presence traveled along causeways and canals with quiet urgency, carried not by panic but by steady observation. From elevated terraces near Texcoco, scribes recorded unusual forms in newly painted codices. Figures with pale faces and metallic coverings were rendered beside images of towering beasts with arched necks. The glyphs carried uncertainty rather than clarity, yet they marked the beginning of a shift that would move far beyond ink and pigment. Within months, the rhythms of cultivation began to adjust under growing pressure. Demands for food increased as foreign encampments expanded. Maize once reserved for temple ceremonies found its way toward new mouths. Storage jars emptied more quickly than anticipated. Fields were expected to yield beyond their accustomed capacity. Along the western shoreline, carpenters dismantled portions of wooden dwellings to provide fuel for unfamiliar cooking methods introduced by the newcomers. Timber once intended for canal reinforcement was redirected, weakening certain chinampa borders. Gradual erosion followed in places where maintenance could no longer be prioritized. In markets near Tlacopan, barter systems encountered metal objects whose purpose remained unclear to many. Shiny blades cut through maize stalks with startling ease, yet they required trade arrangements that disrupted established exchange patterns. Obsidian workshops observed declining demand as iron tools entered circulation. Disease, invisible yet relentless, spread across crowded districts. Labor forces diminished within a single season. Fields once tended by extended families stood partially neglected. Weeds advanced where coordinated effort had previously held them at bay. The landscape responded quickly to absence. In upland terraces beyond the basin, Spanish livestock began grazing on cultivated ground. Cattle trampled young shoots without recognizing field boundaries. Their weight compacted soil carefully loosened by hand tools. Indigenous farmers, unaccustomed to such animals, struggled to adapt protective measures in time. Mission compounds rose upon former ceremonial sites. Around these new structures, enclosed gardens were established following European patterns. Wheat seeds were introduced experimentally into prepared plots. The grain grew differently from maize, forming dense heads rather than exposed ears. Its harvest required size and threshing floors unfamiliar to local practice. Near the slopes of Popocatépetl, friars supervised the clearing of additional land to support monasteries. Forest sections once managed selectively were felled more extensively. Ash from burned wood enriched soil temporarily, Yet long-term balance shifted as canopy cover diminished. Tribute obligations transformed under colonial administration. Instead of symbolic glyphs indicating maize and textiles, written records in alphabetic script demanded quantities in measured weight. This shift altered accountability structures. Communities were now bound to new authorities whose expectations reflected distant economic priorities. Irrigation networks suffered from disrupted coordination. Canal cleaning, formerly organized through communal labor obligations, became irregular. Sediment accumulated in neglected channels. Water distribution grew uneven, leaving certain plots parched while others flooded. Along southern trade routes, cacao groves changed ownership. Some indigenous cultivators were compelled into encomienda arrangements, providing labor under supervision of colonial settlers. Harvesting continued, yet autonomy eroded. Beans destined for ceremonial consumption increasingly entered transatlantic commerce. In the expanding colonial capital built upon the ruins of Tenochtitlan, drainage projects altered the hydrology of the entire basin. Efforts to prevent flooding involved cutting through dikes and redirecting water flow. While protecting new stone structures, these interventions destabilized established agricultural zones dependent on consistent lake levels. Sheep introduced to highland pastures grazed persistently on native vegetation. Their feeding patterns differed from those of deer, removing grasses down to the root. Soil erosion followed during seasonal rains, carving gullies into slopes once stabilized by dense growth. Within indigenous communities, knowledge transmission faced interruption. Elders who carried memory of planting cycles succumbed to illness. Younger generations, confronted by new administrative demands, divided their attention between traditional tasks and imposed obligations. Agricultural expertise, though resilient, encountered fragmentation. Mission orchards flourished with imported fruit trees, apples, pears, and quinces. Their blossoms signaled seasonal change in ways previously unseen. Pollination patterns shifted as bees adapted to additional nectar sources. Honey production expanded in some districts under missionary encouragement. The construction of roads to facilitate movement of goods compacted land across former fields. Stone pathways replaced earthen trails. Trade intensified toward ports connected to global networks, drawing surplus away from local consumption. In valleys beyond the immediate colonial center, resistance persisted quietly through preservation of seed varieties. Farmers continued cultivating indigenous maize strains alongside introduced wheat. Seed selection became an act of continuity, safeguarding flavors and textures linked to memory. New taxation systems required payment in coin rather than goods in certain contexts. To obtain currency, communities sold surplus produce in markets structured by Spanish oversight. Economic pressure encouraged specialization in particular crops, sometimes reducing agricultural diversity. On the northern frontiers, mining operations demanded substantial food supply. Silver extracted from sites such as Zacatecas required provisioning of laborers. Maize shipments traveled long distances, straining production in source regions. Climatic fluctuations during the late 16th century compounded stress. Periods associated with the broader climatic cooling known today as the Little Ice Age shortened growing seasons at higher elevations. Wheat sometimes fared better under cooler conditions, accelerating its adoption in certain areas. Indigenous irrigation techniques gradually merged with European water-lifting devices. Nori is powered by animal labor-raised water from deeper wells, supplementing canal systems compromised by altered lake levels. Hybrid approaches emerged from necessity rather than design. Land tenure transformed as Spanish grants established haciendas encompassing vast tracts. Former communal lands were consolidated under private ownership. Tenant farmers worked parcels once held collectively, altering social organization tied to cultivation. In wetlands previously dominated by chinampas, drainage reduced aquatic biodiversity. Fish populations declined as water quality shifted. Diets adjusted accordingly, relying more heavily on terrestrial livestock introduced from Europe. Despite upheaval, ritual observances connected to planting endured discreetly within communities. Offerings were sometimes reframed within Christian symbolism, yet retained agricultural intent. The soil remained recipient of quiet gestures, seeking favorable yield. Textile production adapted to new fibers. Sheep's wool supplemented cotton, providing materials suited to different climates. Weaving techniques evolved to incorporate these materials, reflecting agricultural change in household crafts. As decades passed, the agricultural mosaic of central Mexico bore layered influences. Fields of maize stood beside wheat plots. Cattle grazed near remnants of chinampas. Stone churches cast shadows across terraces carved generations earlier. Environmental consequences accumulated gradually. Overgrazing reduced vegetative cover, increasing sedimentation in waterways. Deforestation altered rainfall absorption, intensifying flood cycles. Colonial authorities responded intermittently with regulations, though enforcement varied. In remote districts less accessible to colonial centers, indigenous agricultural systems persisted with greater continuity. Terracing techniques and crop rotations survived where external oversight remained limited. These enclaves preserved ecological knowledge refined across centuries. The transformation of agriculture was neither instantaneous nor uniform. It unfolded through negotiation, coercion, adaptation, and endurance. Landscapes absorbed new species, new tools, new administrative frameworks. Yet beneath these layers, the foundational relationship between people and soil continued. Beneath altered skies. As the 17th century advanced, the agricultural landscape of central Mexico entered another stage of adjustment shaped by distant forces and local resolve. Population decline from earlier epidemics gradually slowed, allowing some communities to stabilize their labor capacity. Fields once abandoned began to show signs of renewal. Grasses that had overtaken terraces were cleared, and irrigation ditches were reopened with deliberate patience. In regions bordering the Gulf lowlands, sugarcane cultivation expanded under colonial direction. Mills powered by animal traction crushed tall stalks into sweet liquid destined for refining. This crop demanded constant moisture and careful timing. Its presence introduced a different agricultural rhythm, one tied less to subsistence and more to export markets connected across the Atlantic. Around the rebuilt capital, now known as Mexico City, authorities intensified efforts to control flooding. Massive drainage projects sought to lower lake levels permanently. Channels cut through surrounding hills redirected water toward distant basins. The consequences for agriculture were profound. Chinampa systems that depended upon stable lake conditions lost reliable access to the shallow waters that had once nourished them. Soil dried and compacted, requiring new strategies to maintain fertility. Further north, ranching enterprises spread across arid plateaus. Sheep and cattle roamed expanses once lightly grazed by wildlife. Herding required fencing and seasonal movement guided by mounted riders. Grasslands changed under sustained pressure, and native plant species receded where trampling persisted. Yet livestock also generated manure that, when collected near settlements, enriched nearby vegetable gardens. Mission settlements along frontier zones introduced irrigation methods influenced by Mediterranean practice. Stone aqueducts carried water across uneven terrain into enclosed courtyards. Small orchards flourished within these protected spaces, blending European horticulture with indigenous cultivation techniques. Apricot and peach trees adapted successfully to local climates, offering fruit previously unknown in the region. In valleys east of the capital, textile workshops expanded to meet colonial demand. Indigo dye derived from plants grown in warmer districts colored woven fabrics deep blue. Fields dedicated to dye production required careful harvesting before leaves matured excessively. Processing involved fermentation and drying, linking agriculture to specialized craft. Mining centers continued to exert pressure on food supply networks. Silver production at sites like Guanajuato required steady provisioning of grain and meat. Mule caravans transported maize and wheat across long distances, crossing rugged terrain. Agricultural output increasingly aligned with the needs of extractive industries rather than solely local sustenance. Climatic instability persisted during colder phases associated with broader global patterns. Unexpected frosts damaged maize in higher altitudes, prompting experimentation with hardier varieties. Barley gained favor in some districts because of its relative tolerance to cool conditions. Its cultivation altered dietary patterns modestly, appearing in breads and stews alongside traditional staples. Land tenure arrangements solidified under colonial law. Large estates consolidated smaller holdings through purchase or legal maneuvering. Indigenous communities petitioned for recognition of communal boundaries, sometimes securing formal titles that preserved limited autonomy. Such documents, stored carefully in parish archives, became essential tools. Water rights emerged as source of tension. Control over springs and river diversions determined productivity. In certain valleys, upstream haciendas constructed diversion channels that reduced downstream flow. Communities responded by negotiating seasonal sharing agreements, seeking balance between competing needs. Cattle drives connecting interior ranches to coastal ports created new corridors across the countryside. Hoof-worn paths eventually widened into established routes, influencing settlement patterns along their length. Taverns and supply posts appeared intermittently, supporting movement of goods and livestock. Crop diversification persisted quietly within household gardens. Indigenous farmers continued cultivating amaranth despite periodic discouragement from colonial authorities who associated it with pre-conquest rituals. Its resilience and nutritional value ensured survival within small plots shielded from scrutiny. In mountainous terrain near Sierra Madre Oriental, terracing techniques evolved to address intensified rainfall events. Stone retaining walls were reinforced with additional layers to prevent collapse. These modifications reflected accumulated experience responding to environmental variability. Forestry practices changed as demand for construction timber increased. Pine forests were harvested for beams used in urban building projects. Selective cutting sometimes gave way to broader clearing, altering watershed stability. Replanting efforts were sporadic, dependent upon local initiative rather than centralized planning. Transportation improvements facilitated exchange between distant provinces. River navigation along certain stretches enabled shipment of agricultural goods more efficiently than overland travel. The cultivation of cochineal insects for red dye expanded in semi-arid zones where nopal cacti thrived. Harvesting these tiny creatures required meticulous handling. Once dried, they yielded vibrant pigment prized in European markets. Agricultural attention thus extended beyond plant and animal husbandry into insect rearing, demonstrating adaptive ingenuity. Educational institutions operated by religious orders taught agricultural management alongside literacy. Manuals translated into local languages described pruning techniques and irrigation maintenance. Knowledge exchange occurred gradually, blending empirical observation with imported instruction. Seismic activity occasionally disrupted irrigation channels and terrace walls. Earthquakes common to the region fractured stone structures, requiring repair before planting seasons resumed. Such events reminded cultivators of geological forces shaping their environment beyond human control. As urban populations grew modestly during the later 17th century, demand for fresh produce increased. Market gardens flourished on the outskirts of the capital, supplying vegetables harvested at dawn and transported swiftly to city plazas. Lettuce, onions, and herbs complemented traditional staples, reflecting dietary blending. Taxation reforms introduced in the 18th century sought to increase efficiency within colonial administration. Agricultural censuses attempted to quantify production more precisely. Surveyors measured fields with chains and recorded acreage in standardized units, transforming land into numerical abstraction. In the Baguio region, fertile plains became center of intensive wheat cultivation. Large estates utilized plow teams drawn by oxen to prepare expansive tracts. Harvest involved coordinated labor forces wielding sickles under supervision. Grain stored in granaries lined with thick adobe walls awaited shipment to milling centers. Indigenous communities participated in these evolving systems while maintaining internal governance structures. Councils allocated communal plots, oversaw irrigation schedules, and mediated disputes. Despite external authority, local leadership remained integral to agricultural continuity. By the late 18th century, Enlightenment ideas circulating through colonial society encouraged experimentation in crop rotation and soil management. Some landowners adopted practices intended to reduce nutrient depletion, incorporating legumes between grain cycles. Although adoption varied, awareness of scientific agriculture began influencing decision-making. Global trade connections expanded further following administrative reforms that opened additional ports. Agricultural commodities traveled across oceans with increasing regularity. The countryside felt distant tremors of international markets, where prices fluctuated beyond local awareness. Throughout these centuries, the underlying resilience of rural communities persisted. Ritual observances adapted yet endured, often intertwined with Christian festivals marking planting and harvest. Processions moved along field boundaries seeking blessing for crops, merging belief systems without erasing ancestral memory. At the threshold of the 19th century, political currents gathered strength that would soon reshape governance. Yet across valleys and plateaus, farmers continued tending soil shaped by layers of history. Fields bore traces of chinampa foundations, colonial plow furrows, and newly introduced orchard rows. The sky above remained constant witness to transformation. Clouds drifted over landscapes altered by conquest, commerce, and climate. Beneath that sky, seeds were still pressed into earth with expectation of growth. Agriculture had become a tapestry woven from indigenous knowledge, European influence, and environmental response. Its threads intertwined through centuries of upheaval and adaptation. Even as new political identities emerged in the approaching era of independence, the bond between land and labor endured, carrying forward memory embedded within soil itself.